Hello. You're listening to the Chronicles, the podcast of the Centre for Viking and Medieval Studies at Aarhus University. I'm Richard Cole. People in the Middle Ages told fantastic stories of animated statues. The god Óðinn was said to have used Byzantine magic to create a golden likeness of himself, which could speak and answer questions. The English churchman, Robert Grosseteste, was reputed to have an head of brass to forge and make it for to tell of such things as befell. That is to say, a bronze head which could see into the future. These were obviously fanciful tales, but there was a reality to medieval attempts to fashion automatons. Across Europe, one could find in the inventories of medieval churches, monasteries and cathedrals statues of saints with articulated, poseable limbs, statues of Christ which bled, statues of the Virgin Mary which lactated, and even statues which appeared, like Grosseteste's and Óðinn's, to talk. Joining me to talk about these animated statues of the Middle Ages, what one scholar has referred to as medieval robots, is Katrine Skinnebach, Associate Professor of Art History at Aarhus University and a fellow member of the Centre for Viking and Medieval Studies. Before we start talking about these amazing artifacts, I think of them as medieval robots. I'm not the first person to come across that, to use that phrase. I want to ask you something that I'm asking everybody in this series. What does the Middle Ages mean to you? This is obviously an artificial period. No one in the Middle Ages walked around saying, "Isn't it fantastic being in a medieval time?" It is a concept that historians have come up with afterwards. So, is there a meaning in the Middle Ages to you? Is there a medieval spirit or a sense of continuity in this period?
Oh, man, that's a difficult question, Richard. I mean, obviously one of the most difficult ones, because of course I do see that there is a kind of medieval spirit. One thing that binds the Middle Ages together is obviously Christianity. I see it as the Christian period. I mean, under the regulation of the Roman Catholic Church. But there is, especially from me as an art historian, coming from the visual culture perspective, there is obviously some ways of expressing visually that is, or visual expression that is very typical of the Middle Ages if it's compared to antiquity and the Renaissance or early modernity. So there is a kind of, I mean, you can see it in the visual language, you can see it in the way people think about themselves in relation to society and in relation to God and spirituality. That kind of binds things together. But of course, I mean, the whole concept of the Middle Ages is superficial. I mean, it's obviously a much later notion of this medium aevum, something that lies in between antiquity and Renaissance.
I suppose if we're going to talk about visual culture, it would be unfair to say that the Middle Ages is a time when people found it really difficult to draw hands. I guess that's not really fair.
No, it's not fair. I think talking about being good at drawing something, that's, again, a very Renaissance notion or early modern notion of how to depict the world. The whole idea of perspective and drawing something according to nature, it's a much later notion. That's not how the medieval painters or sculptors necessarily saw the world.
Okay, we'll let them off the hook for that then, that particular charge. Well, let's get down to business about these animated devices of the Middle Ages. It's an area in which you're an expert. Can we maybe start by talking about the chronological and geographical range of these animated devices? Where and when in Europe could you reasonably expect to walk into a church or any other setting and come across a statue that could lactate, sweat, bleed, or move in any other way?
Well, I think the tradition as such of producing mechanical images, I mean, it has a long history. It goes all the way back to antiquity, and you'll find it in Arabic countries as well. So it does exist outside of Europe as well. But I can't remember who exactly said this, but a medieval historian said that at some point, at least from the 13th century, every city with some self-respect would have an animated image or a spectacle of some kind that included animated images in processions or in a church
So we're talking about somewhere around the 13th century, these things becoming pretty widespread across
widespread,
Europe.
all across Europe. But I mean, it was before that. I think it existed, but it was debated. So it does have a story, and it's something that it's negotiated throughout the Middle Ages.
You mentioned that the Arab world had this sort of technology possibly earlier to Western Europe. Can you say a bit more here about was there a perception in the Middle Ages that the animated image was especially present in, say, Byzantium or in the Arab world? Did people in Latin Europe think that, well, maybe we have these things, but these things are really, most of them are found in the marvelous East? Is that a perception people in the Middle Ages had?
At some point, there was a lot of writing about the Arabic countries and their animated objects or their mechanics. But it was all, especially in religious texts, it was framed as a fraud. It was something that stole the vision from people, because you when you're looking at a mechanical object, you wouldn't be able to kind of see why it moved as it did. So it stole your vision away. That was one of the main ways of describing this, what happened when you interacted with these mechanical devices. And so, I mean, from a religious perspective, in Arabic countries, when they used these animated images, it would usually be for the purpose of cheating people. So this was something
that's the perception in the texts.
That's the perception in the Latin world of these mechanics. And then later on, I mean, it's always there in some ways, but then later on, especially in the 13th century, they are embraced more and more in the Latin countries as well. So
I see something of that in this story in Saxo Grammaticus, who's a intellectual and also a warrior, in fact, writing in the early 1200s, this story that I referenced here at the beginning of the episode. He tells this story that the god Óðinn, who originally in Saxo's telling is a human, basically a wizard. It's not an unknown trope in medieval writing to say that pagan gods were real humans and wizards, what we call euhemerism. It says that he comes from Byzantium to the north and tries to get people to worship him, and he brings this animated picture of himself that can talk, right? And that's part of what fools Scandinavians into believing he's a god. So the story goes, and it seems to me that accords quite well with what you're saying, in that there's an idea here of being led astray. Right, this technology comes from the East, but it's linked somehow to religious trickery, right? To falling into the wrong faith, whether that's Greek Christianity, which of course from a Latin perspective is almost as bad, if not worse, than Islam, or it's Islam itself. Is that a fair summary of that tendency?
Yeah, it is. I mean, it's always the images or the technologies of the other that are the problem. I mean, right. Even though you start embracing it yourself. So even though mechanics, I mean, we had there's a specific kind of Romanesque sculpture, the Sede Sapientia. It's a Madonna figure. She's frontally seated, and she has a child seated on her lap. And from a very early age, I mean, even from 900s or something like that, that child would be detachable. So you can actually move it, and the statue would be moved around for ceremonies inside the church. And perhaps this child was, especially later on, used for the nativity play. So, I mean, there is a kind of a sense of these statues being dynamic, animated in, I mean, even dressing or carrying around is a kind of very simple form of animation. But so it's been done all the time, while at the same time rejecting the images of the others that had these mechanical trickeries.
The detachable baby Jesus. That's absolutely fascinating. Is there a liturgical dimension to this? Is there, when you detach Jesus, is there something to do with putting him back onto the statue? Is that something we can know anything about? Is there a ritual dimension to it?
This is still something that we are kind of looking into, but we know especially, I mean, the use of these animated figures was very well established in the 13th century. So especially from the 1300s and towards the Reformation, at least here in the north, we know that these things were used. So before that, it's still something that we are kind of investigating and looking into. But the whole idea of detachable baby Jesus is kind of well known from a later period, that baby Jesus would be used for liturgical purposes, even for the nativity play, for example, which was kind of a part of the liturgical celebrations. It could also be outside of liturgy. It could be lent to women in labor, so they could bring the child home, and the child would help them with a safe birth, and then it would be put back into church afterwards.
Wow. Well, that leads me to a question. We're using this term animated devices or animated statues. Those are our terms when we speak modern English. But is it possible to say anything about how far people in the Middle Ages drew a line between animate and inanimate, and what was the sort of language they used to talk about these contraptions? Are we committing anachronism when we talk about animation and animated devices, animated statues? Did they just perhaps think of statues? Or?
Well, again, there is a difference between, perhaps, I always find it difficult to use the term popular culture because it's a bit of an anachronism as well.
Yeah, I don't think there's anything wrong with anachronism. For that,
you don't?
I don't. I think I'm getting off topic here, but medievalists can be extraordinarily snooty about talking about anachronism. But unless you want to write your book in medieval Latin, guess what? You're going to be using anachronism. I mean, a lot of the things that we think of as real, solid scholarship kind of terms. I mean, economic historians who talk about the Steuerstaat, right, the tax-dependent state. No one in the Middle Ages talked about that, right? But we accept that. Economics, politics, these are all anachronisms. But we have to apprehend the past somehow. So I'm not upset about anachronisms. But sorry, it's a bit of a diatribe from my side. But is there?
But there is a vocabulary.
There is, yeah. Okay.
And I think that's one of the reasons why we wanted to pick up on this animism, because the term anima, animus, Latin term for spirit, is used a lot, especially in theology. Thomas Aquinas has a whole kind of analysis of statues and animate statues. So he does use the term in that connection.
What can I ask you? What does Thomas Aquinas? Thomas Aquinas, of course, I'm sure listeners know this, but early 13th century Aristotelian thinker, right? One of the most important thinkers in the high medieval church. What does he have to say about animated statues and sculptures?
Statuas animatas are a problem. It's a kind of he does relate it to superstition and false magic or demonic magic. But at the same time, he does kind of state that it exists. But you think it's a fraud. He believes in statuas animatas, but it's a demonic fraud. So it should be rejected by the church and by, the faithful.
Okay, so there is an internal struggle happening inside Christianity about these things.
There is.
That's interesting.
Yeah. But then at the same time, to kind of argue that this is something that everyone would know about, know these terms. Of course, we're not sure if the main populace would use the term statuas animatas. I don't think so.
Right, okay.
But Aquinas does, and he does discuss it. So it's a term that does circulate. It is known in the Middle Ages. And it's interesting to use it because today we do talk about animation in all kinds of ways in aesthetic culture and stuff like that. But knowing exactly what animation means, is it only something that we use in terms of animation, making movies like anime movies, stuff like that?
Films,
animated films. Or does it mean something else? Can we use it for describing, for example, robots? So trying to go back to a period where they actually had a very refined understanding of the term and use it and try to show that this is, it also means this. I think that's one of the things that we're very interested in.
I'm imagining when you talk about this, there's a if you like, a high discourse about animated statues. Someone like Thomas Aquinas with his students, people who've read the Latin version of Aristotle, having a good chinwag about it. But when you talk about these objects, I get a sense of wonder about them. For the congregation in a cathedral, seeing these things operate, it must have been the high part of it must have been the crescendo of a liturgical episode, right? Of a part of a church service. Seeing the robot, if you like, brought out and made to do its thing.
Yes, it would be. And we do have descriptions of plays in particular, mystery plays, where these animated sculptures, that would be a figure of Christ with kind of jointed arms and a bleeding side wound and stuff like that. We have descriptions of the experience of these objects that kind of like people saying, that's the most beautiful play I've ever seen, the most beautiful passion play that really touched my heart. And we have descriptions of the figure of Christ on the cross. We have it like kind of lying on the stage, and then the crucifix is erected with the Christ figure on it, and then the populace starts to cry. So there is a lot of description about how people experience this. So of course it was a marvel. It was a huge sense of marvel. But then at the same time, some of these objects would be kind of, you could see them in church on a daily basis. They wouldn't be necessarily hidden away. Some would, but not all of them. Some of them would be possible to study them and look at the chords and the joints and everything. It was not that it was, the way I understand it, and when I've studied it, I don't get a sense of this being hidden away so that it was supposed to trick people. I think that's a post-medieval notion.
Right, yes.
Yeah.
I mean, particularly we're recording here in Denmark, and Lutheranism is everywhere in the air here, right? There's always this idea lurking somewhere in our thoughts in this part of the world that the high medieval church is out to trick people and deceive people. It's good to get away from that canard, if you like. Talking about the wonder of these objects is fascinating to me. I know that a number of them survive, and I wonder if I can de-wonderfy them, if that's a word, which almost certainly isn't, for a moment. A number of these objects survive. Can we say anything about how they actually function? What sorts of mechanisms are inside them? For example, a statue that's supposed to lactate or bleed. How does that work? There's a pouch somewhere where a liquid is poured in round the back or something like that? Or how do they function?
Well, different mechanisms. I mean, some of them would have like cords, so that, I mean, like kind of drawstring puppets.
So a bit like a marionette.
Yeah, so you could move it from behind, and you'd have a cylinder, perhaps, behind the side wound that could be filled with liquids. And we know from some of the passion plays that then it would be kind of covered with wax. And then at the moment when Longinus kind of pricks his spear into Christ's side wound, he would penetrate the wax, and then the liquid would flow out. That could be, I mean, wine and water, or it could be blood, mainly pig's blood, I think, would be used. So animal blood of some kind, mixed with water, for example. Some of the figures could also cry. So for the Virgin Mary, you'd have a cavity in the head that could be filled with water, and then the water would kind of like go through the eyes. It would be small channels between this cavity and then the eyes. There is one description where the cavity in the head is filled with water and small fish, and then when the fish swam, the water would kind of like gradually be kind of pressed out.
I'm not an engineer by any stretch of the imagination. That particular description presumably cannot be true.
I don't know. They're very imaginative. But they were great engineers. I think that's really what kind of. Some of them, they would also use a sponge in Virgin Mary's head, because then not all the water would flow out at once, like kind of a flush, but then just gradually. That was what they were after. Like, how do we make
this image of the Virgin Mary's head with fish swimming around inside it is absolutely fantastic.
It's brilliant, isn't it?
Yeah.
I love it. Yeah.
You mentioned being gifted engineers. Do the sources let us know anything about what sort of person is constructing these? Are we looking at some sort of master craftsperson who specializes in animated statues, or is it something that any sculptor would have known a little bit about? Is it a highly specialized skill? Are there workshops that we know about that were producing these things, or do the sources not really illuminate that?
We don't know for the Northern European area yet. That's something that we are looking into at the moment. Even trying to discover these animated figures is a bit more difficult in the north, but we can perhaps get back to that. The answer is the Reformation, of course. But in the south, in Italy, for example, we have Tedesco. He kind of made a lot of animated Christ figures, especially for the Franciscan market. And he specialized in facial movements. So a lot of his figures would have the ability to open the mouth and a tongue that could be made to fall out. So when Christ died, kind of the tongue would fall out of his mouth, and movement of the eyes. So a lot of facial expressions, that would be his speciality.
When you describe them like this, it makes me think of those antiquated seaside attractions that we have in Britain and also in America. I'm not sure if they're found in other countries. Often quite terrifying, actually. To us, to modern people, they seem, these Zoltran figures, for example. It's a fortune-telling machine. You put in a coin and a machine, the features of the face move and it speaks a sort of recorded message. They're uncanny to us today. The descriptions you're talking about make it seem as though perhaps they weren't so uncanny to people in the Middle Ages. I'm not hearing horror.
No, and if we kind of take into consideration that every city would have had these figures, it wouldn't, of course it was a marvel, like you said, but then again it wouldn't be horror or surprise or no. It's something different.
Yeah. Be
acknowledgement or joy, and I think they really enjoyed seeing these things, and that's mainly what I read in the sources, that they enjoyed it. It was entertaining, and it was beautiful, and it was moving as well. Because one of the things that we in our recent book on animation, mechanical magic and miraculous animation, one of the things that we wrote about was this whole idea of the fact that animation, of course, this whole idea of that animation is not trickery. It's not supposed to trick people, because everyone knows what it's about. They know the workings, they know the mechanics. Mechanics was part of everyday life. You'd have organs that produced sound by the use of air. You'd have bells producing sound with the use of a string, a drawstring. You'd have wagons, you'd have lifting mechanisms. There would be so many mechanical devices all around. So these things would not have been novel to people. They would know it from everyday life and from working life. So they would have seen it, but still they enjoyed technology, and they enjoyed that. What it showed them in church was that even the death of Christ was still, Christ on the cross, he dies, but he still has movable limbs. So hanging there, he still has potential life in him. So it's a magnificent way of showing the death of a person who is about to resurrect again. And I think this is what people would have seen in this figure, instead of seeing, the Reformation notion of it was that they made these sculptures move to trick people into thinking that Christ was there. But I think rather it's the other way around, that these images showed them that Christ could potentially be there, or could potentially come to life again.
It reminds me of a point made actually several times by a historian of the Reformation, Dermot McCulloch, but he's actually really talking about the Middle Ages and the period including the Reformation, where he says that for this period, this pre-modern period, it required substantially more imagination to imagine a world without a God than it did to believe in God. That for the period of the Middle Ages, and quite possibly what comes before, but we're interested in the Middle Ages today, people knew with a certainty that we can scarcely imagine today that God was real, that there was a heaven, and that you had to do what was necessary in order to get into heaven. Right? And I wonder if that is a part of the joyous sort of presence of these statues. There's nothing to be afraid of. There's no sense of the uncanny, because what you're seeing before you is part of a general apprehension of the universe, right? That you know all this to be true anyway, and now you're seeing it gloriously celebrated.
Yeah, I agree on that. I really agree. And then again, some of these figures would also show you how to see the world, that you should, for animated figures, I think they show you that the world is alive, that the world is animable.
Do you have a particular favourite animated sculpture in terms of the ones that actually exist or the ones that survive? Is there one that you think of as particularly special?
There are so many, but the one that I've studied the most, one of the animated Christ figures, is the Mirakelmann aus Döbeln. It's a German figure, which is kind of amazing because it has everything.
Do we know when and where it's from, roughly?
Döbeln.
It's from Döbeln, okay.
Yeah, in Germany. Today it's in a Lutheran church, St. Nikolai Kirche.
And do we have a date on it, roughly?
It's from early 16th century. It's this jointed Christ doll. It's made of wood, and it has this bleeding side wound and jointed elbows and knees and hips and feet and everything. It can be moved in so many ways.
Fully opposable.
Exactly, yeah. So that one is quite amazing. But then again, I'm quite into these Northern European animable sculptures, and I have a certain interest in St. George, where we do have examples of, especially in England, of course, the writings of St. George. St. George on a horse being kind of carried around the city, but we seem to have that in Sweden as well. So this huge St. George sculpture from the big cathedral in Stockholm it has been suggested by a Swedish art historian that it would have been detached from its wooden horse and perhaps even put on the back of a real horse and and carried into the streets of Sweden, or perhaps on its present horse and then carried around in some way. Because it was supposed to, all the relics of Sweden were supposed to, or the Stockholm It was supposed to be carried out into the streets once a year on a specific date.
Okay.
And this particular figure has some very, very nice relics in a breast case. So it's believed that it was carried around as well.
And when you say relics in a breast case, so there would have been some sort of window in the chest,
yes,
where bones or bits of St. George would have been kept on display.
Yeah.
Yes, it's
exactly.
almost a steampunk or medieval punk kind of,
it is very
kind
much.
of image. Yeah. There's a book by E.R. Truitt, Medieval Robots. I've quite enjoyed this book. You're a specialist in the subject. I'm not certain how you feel about it. But I want to maybe raise that question of talking about robots in this context. It seems to me that when we think about robots, we have this disconnect between what we imagine in our literature, and of course for us literature includes films and video games and what have you. We dream of something really quite sophisticated, right? We can watch movies that feature androids that cannot even be distinguished from human beings. But then when we meet robots in real life, I think most people's experience of them is fairly dismal. If you meet a robot that works, it's probably a Roomba, one of these ones that sort of hoovers up dust on the floor. More often than not, they're malfunctioning and actually not very impressive. A few years ago, there was an exhibition on robots at the Science Museum in London that I went to, and they'd set up a full hall full of state-of-the-art robots. And I only got tickets right at the end of the exhibitions. They'd all been left running for more than a month. And people had come in and set them up, but then whoever it was who came in and set them up, the curators didn't know how to maintain these things or fix them. And by the end, it was like going into a sort of awfully run zoo full of traumatized animals. The robots were kind of flailing, repeatedly glitching, seemed almost to be begging for the sweet release of death. I mean, it was an awful thing. I'm reminded of also about a year ago, something like that, when Elon Musk promised us a state-of-the-art android, right? And what was brought out was a human dancer in a lycra suit, right, who did a dance routine dressed as a robot and then left. There was this huge gap, is what I'm trying to say, between the reality of robots and what we imagine about them. How far did people in the Middle Ages, do we think, experience a gap between stories of animated statues and actual animated statues?
That's a good question. Because, the stories are usually... And some of these figures, they grow by the telling. Especially the Boxley animated crucifix. It's
the Boxley animated crucifix.
It's a well-known crucifix from England. It was destroyed during the Reformation in England, so we don't know what it looked like. But it continues to pop up in different tales, and it's more like at the end it moves its brows. It can do everything, and it's an amazing figure towards the end, but it grows by the telling, so it's really a very sophisticated robot.
Okay.
Yeah. But I don't think that's how it's been experienced. So I think tales of these figures, especially the ones that were experienced in the Middle East, for example, they sound like, you couldn't tell the difference between a human and a robot. So, the telling is usually like very vivid. They can do everything, and yeah.
So there
is a difference. I do think there is a.
Although I suppose what we can't know is whether there was ever a sense of disappointment. We're disappointed by robots. Actually, from what you're saying, it doesn't sound like people, as far as we can tell, were disappointed by sculpture.
So.
No.
I don't think so, because they was not supposed to imitate life in that way. In that sense,
yes,
that's kind difference. That's the difference today, that we kind of expected to be able to imitate life. And they were not, I think, in the Middle Ages. Of course, I'm speculating here.
Yes. Perhaps medieval robots is a term I should stay away from.
I love the term, and I love the book.
Yeah,
by Truitt. I think it's an amazing book, and she has so many. Well, it's a very rich book, so many great examples, and I mean, many of my examples, again, are inspired by her book.
Well, recommended then to listeners to the podcast. I'm going to round off soon, but a slightly salacious question, if I may. These lactating sculptures, do we know anything about how they worked or how they were used? Are we talking some sort of hydraulic, some sort of pumping system, or?
Well, the thing is, I haven't yet seen a specific mechanical lactating Madonna. So the lactating Madonna is mainly from miraculous tales, but you'd have plenty of tales from especially monasteries with monks and nuns drinking directly from the breasts or the side wound of Christ, the fluids running out there. And if it's actually, we have speculated if these would be actual images, because I mean, we have so many images, especially of bleeding Christ figures, that would have been possible to drink from, I suppose.
So, I mean, we are potentially imagining devotees of primarily the Virgin Mary actually drinking the milk out of the breasts of these statues, potentially.
I imagine that would be possible.
Okay, yeah.
Especially because they would have these nuns, especially in the Netherlands, would have these small Christ dolls that they would nurture, dress and bathe and then what would they do? What else would they do? They would have little beds, tuck them in at night, and they might breastfeed them as well.
What a way to be close to Christ.
Yeah, it's an amazing way, and they would sleep in their beds, I think, or if they kind of woke up in the middle of the night. There is a tale of a nun, I think it's Mechthild of Magdeburg, who wakes up, I think it's her, she wakes up in the middle of the night.
She was into some freaky stuff.
Yeah, and then this Christ child is kind of, pick me up. She's, no, I tucked you in nicely, go to sleep now, go to sleep.
And so in that story, the miraculous part is that the inanimate image has started talking. Yes. The doll has started talking.
I think so, because she owned such a doll. So there does seem to be kind of like people who owned these dolls or interacted with them might also have miraculous experiences. So, I mean, yeah, there is a kind of an overlap there.
And in that miracle tale you're talking about, the thing that strikes me is that her having the doll is not the miraculous part, is not the wondrous part. The wondrous part is God making it speak.
Yeah.
That's the part that's would have been surprising to people. Not that a nun should have such a thing.
Mm-mm.
So, by way of rounding off, I want to ask you the question of why do we rarely see animated sculpture in devotion today? In fact, do we see it anywhere in the world today? It seems like a tradition that's disappeared, and I think most listeners will find it something quite surprising and quite arresting. How did we end up there? What caused the decline of this art form?
Well, I mean, of course, there was the whole debate about images in the Reformation, but now we're talking Northern European.
So if you're in a Reformation country,
yeah.
So this is Scandinavia, northern part of Germany, England in its own confused way,
Netherlands, of course.
So this is a change that's happening from the early to mid 1500s.
Yeah, exactly. Some of these images, images were debated in general. What is the use of images, and especially what images can we use? And in Denmark, Sweden, Norway, there was a fear of animated images. We see that in many of the sources, that the whole idea of people believing that images were alive or that God would be present in images is something that, it's expressed in so many sources. So I think there is an attempt to kind of neutralize images so that people don't believe them to be alive. And especially these animated figures became protagonists in some of these tales.
When you talk about these sorts of sources that are about rejecting the image here in Northern Europe. You were talking about Reformation authors, essentially.
Yeah, Reformation authors. Reformers. It could be Martin Luther. He wrote about an animated image. Niels Pelagius, a Danish theologian, wrote about an animated Christ figure.
In a contemptuous way.
Yeah, yeah. A long time ago, some monks made an image, blah, 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 etc. And then they lured the people to donate money to them. Yeah. So it's always about monks tricking people to donate money.
And of course, we're still, you and I, Laurie, both teach medieval studies at Aarhus University, and I still get students who begin their essays, in the Middle Ages, the monks did X, terrible thing to the poor peasants. Right? We're still living with these myths. Yeah.
So, I mean, from a theological perspective, especially in Northern Europe, the theologians were very much against this. And some of these images may have been destroyed, but other images were altered, appropriated, so that they fit into this new religious context. And that's why we're writing a book at the moment. It's called The Objects of Animation, or that's a working title at least. We don't know if that's the way it's going to turn out at the end, but we are trying to discover these objects because they do exist in some of the written sources, as I told you, with Niels Pelagius. So there must have been animated figures in Denmark, Sweden, and Norway as well. And we have found quite a few images by now. Okay. So we're looking forward to write about them, but they're kind of hidden away. They've been moved out of the churches into museums. The movable parts have been covered, or
so they've been deanimated.
They've been altered to fit new religious purposes or new religious ideas. So deanimation neutralized in some way. Yeah.
Well, that covers Northern Europe. Do we know about the decline in non-Reformed Europe, in Catholic Europe?
I mean, with the whole so-called Counter-Reformation, some of these images, especially in Spain, there was a ban of this kind of images, but they did survive even after or during the Counter-Reformation as well. And we do have in some areas of Europe where they still practice these things. I mean, in Germany, even today, we have the Palmesel, which is Christ seated on an ass, being dragged along. It has wheels underneath, being dragged along in the streets for Palmesøndag. What is that?
Palm Sunday.
Palmesøndag.
Yeah, Palm Sunday.
Palm Sunday.
Yeah.
So some of these traditions still survives in some places.
It's not completely gone.
No. And I mean, especially if we think of a guy like Kamil Kopania. He's a Polish theatre historian, I think he is. He's kind of he's discovered so many animable Christ figures. I mean, it's an amazing book about animated sculptures of Christ in the Middle Ages. And there are so many, he's especially found them in Poland. So they seem to have kind of survived.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Well, Laura, thank you so much for coming to talk to us about these strange medieval devices. And we're all going to really be looking forward to the book.
Thanks. Thanks for inviting me. It's been great.
Thanks for coming on. The Chronicles was funded by Aarhus Universitets Forskningsfond. Sound production and original music was by Kirsi Tilk of Tilk Sonics. If you're interested in news and events at the Centre, you can visit our website at cas.au.dk/cvm. I've been Richard Cole. Thank you for listening.